emphasizing that everything started with Crimea and will end with Crimea. Ukraine announced that it would continue its offensive to take back its lands until the end. The moment of the war's breaking point will begin at this point. Ukraine and Russia are preparing for a great spring offensive. The target of the Ukrainian forces is Crimea, and the Russian army feels this to their lowest units. Ukraine's breakthrough in Crimea witnessed the mass flight or evacuation of Russian citizens from Crimea. For this reason, we see that the Russian army has strengthened the defense in Crimea and evacuated relatives of officers and important civilians to Russia. Let's take a closer look at the Russian army's plans for the Crimean evacuation and Ukraine's breakthrough in Crimea. Families and relatives of the Russian forces on the peninsula have been making preparations to escape from Crimea for a long time. The residents of this peninsula, who were preparing to flee by selling their immovables and real estate, as well as the families of the soldiers and the relatives of pro-Russian officials, began to be evacuated. This ignites a social indignation from Crimea. However, investigating the root cause of these evacuations will lead us to a much more accurate point. Let's take a closer look at this issue with official statements. The Chief of General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported this week that the families of Russian invaders were deported to Russia from Perevalna in the Crimea. The Chief of Staff report says, once again, certain categories of citizens are being evacuated from temporarily occupied Crimea. Recently, military personnel of the Russian occupation forces stationed in Perevalna are sending their families to Russia. In a report published by the Crimean National Resistance Group, it was stated that the occupiers had made a list of workers and their families subject to priority evacuation, and that in some cities the plans had already been drawn up and approved. A Russian media organ made a statement on this subject. In the statement made, allegations were made that an earthquake might be in question. This is pretty funny. However, the publication later pointed out that since it's not yet possible to predict earthquakes, it can be assumed that officials were evacuated due to the threat of the Ukrainian army advancing on the peninsula. The evacuation of certain categories of citizens from the temporarily occupied Crimea began. In addition, it was announced that evacuation plans were prepared in the town of Krasnoperekopsk, close to the Ukrainian mainland, in the north of the peninsula. On the other hand, urban construction companies temporarily stopped their activities in the occupied Crimea due to supply exceeding demand in the real estate market. Also, officers in Russian-occupied Simferopol are preparing to evacuate. It is reported that at state-owned enterprises of Simferopol, officers are given to fill out questionnaires, in which, in case of evacuation, the full name of the evacuee and the composition of the family are indicated. We see that the Russian officers in Crimea and their relatives were evacuated by air, land, and sea, and the current evacuation routes were drawn. There are several ways to escape from Crimea. You can go to the Krasnodar region of Russia by train or car over the Kerch Bridge. In addition, it is possible to escape Russia via the Azov Sea by ferry from the public transport piers in Crimea. Several 100,000 citizens of the island, with a population of 2.5 million, have already fled so far. With the increase in the attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces on the peninsula after August, we have witnessed many times that Russian citizens in Crimea left the island in masses. At the moment, while the Russian army is preparing a massive military defense on the peninsula, and the Ukrainian forces are attacking the Russian military elements in Crimea at least once a week, the escape of Russian citizens on the peninsula is accelerating. Expressing that this war will not end at the table, both countries point out that the second year of the Ukraine-Russia war will be even more critical. In this direction, it is seen that Crimea, which has been the main source of the ongoing conflict and war for years, has been evacuated due to the threat of the Ukrainian army advancing on the peninsula. One of the most important strategic points of the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula, will be the battlefield that will determine the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war. We'll begin to examine this point that needs attention. But will Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky fulfill his promise to drive Russian forces out of all occupied territories, including Crimea? Will Ukraine fight to the end to reclaim this historic and strategic peninsula? Let's try to measure the determination and possibilities on this issue. Crimea served as a springboard for the Russian invasion that began last February, paving the way for Russian forces to occupy most of southern Ukraine. The Ukrainian government, on the other hand, knows that Russia cannot content itself with keeping control of Crimea. In the coming days, we will witness how Ukraine will determine the results and conditions of its preparations for the final liberation of Crimea. It will be determined by the performance of Kiev, which is preparing to attack with a new Russian attack that is expected to start in the near future, and its fierce desire to take back control of the occupied areas. In other words, the fate of Crimea seems to determine the winner of the war. There are many reasons for the liberation of Crimea. For example, Russia's military presence is actually a reason to fight for Crimea, as a war over this region would severely reduce Russia's ability to fight and threaten Ukraine and other states. After successive successes on the battlefield, it is clear that Ukraine has the capacity to liberate Crimea. While some Crimeans want to remain part of Russia, many more are happy to escape the clutches of the Kremlin. After all, when history is evaluated honestly, it is clear that Crimea should be part of Ukraine, not Russia. While Crimea, which was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014, was not the hotspot of the current war, Crimea nevertheless remained a constant feature of the war, and Crimea lurks with the prospect of being recaptured by Kiev. A red line for Russian President Vladimir Putin, too, Crimea is within sight of the Kiev armed forces. Ukrainian forces can retake Crimea, and that is no longer as difficult as it seems. What about the possibility of Ukraine finally retaking Crimea? Is it possible? Ukraine has put a lot of pressure to buy more advanced weapons from the West to completely clear the occupiers from the Crimea and the country's territory. A powerful air and naval operation to accompany the 100,000 Ukrainian troops needed to seize the Crimea. In other words, a combined gun attack. This requires bringing in Ukraine's best units and equipment, such as the elite airstrike forces to act as shock troops, and air assets such as the MiG-29 Fulcrum jet fighter and Mi-24 Hind helicopter to provide and cover air cover. Additional weapons are still needed to make the Ukrainian victory in Crimea worthwhile. It was the seemingly eerie numerical disparity between the armed forces of Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainian army may have fewer troops, but more paramilitary personnel that can be deployed effectively in defense. The Russian army, on the other hand, has a limited number of troops that can be deployed in Ukraine, and may not be as effective in defensive operations. In addition, Russia's attrition, that is, human losses and material losses, Russia's losses in Ukraine exceed the limits. After all, it does not seem impossible for Ukraine to liberate Crimea. It turns out that Putin's nuclear threats were just a bluff to deter further Western support for Ukraine. Ukraine has driven Russian forces out of areas like Kherson, where Putin now claims to be a part of Russia, without encountering a nuclear response. This was a serious indicator for Ukraine and the West. In short, the war will continue, and the West's involvement in the war is so deep that it reached the point of no return. The war will be resolved in Crimea. Therefore, it seems that Kiev will not stop fighting until it retakes Crimea. Russia's possessions of Crimea is not just a security risk for Ukraine. Moscow's holding of the peninsula puts the whole world in danger. Putin, his possible successors, continue the war with a country whose army has been significantly weakened and has been subjected to heavy sanctions. Russian military capabilities are severely deteriorated. Russia's remaining troops are exhausted, and the country's stockpiles of advanced missiles are on the verge of running out. Naval bases, air bases, and supply routes to Crimea were damaged by Ukrainian attacks. Ukraine, on the other hand, will continue to fight with its more capable armed forces, thus inflicting more defeats. Although it's not easy to take back Crimea, Ukraine has the ability to do so. The United States and its partners no longer hesitate to support any plan to return Crimea to Ukraine. Thus, Kiev and its allies will continue to fight until they force Moscow to surrender Crimea through negotiations, or until Ukraine forcibly takes the peninsula from Moscow. The liberation of Crimea will also set an important historical precedent for the whole world. If Ukraine cannot retake Crimea and Russia does not face any sanctions, other states will be more likely to engage in wars of conquest. Recapturing Crimea, then, is vital to prevent future conflicts and prevent a return to a period of conquest. You can support us with the Super Thanks button below. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications in order to be informed about new videos. Our contents are carefully prepared by our expert team. This content only belongs to Oracle Eye's YouTube channel. We legally fight all channels, social media platforms, and websites that use our content without our permission. Thank you for watching us.